All right. That way, I usually post the lectures to the class as well for students who may not be able to attend. So, but yes, I'll go ahead and start off our class. Dr. Taggart is one of my colleagues in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. In addition to being a fairly well-regarded, pretty incredible instructor, he's also heading up I just lost the word, internships. There we go. Our internships in the school. And so he has asked to jump in and give you guys more information. I strongly encourage doing any and all internships that you are interested in, especially the congressional internships. They are some of the best ways to really get to see this whole government thing in action. So by all means, you have my endorsement as students if you need anything on that end, but I'll let Gable go ahead and talk to you about some of those opportunities.
Yes, thanks, Zach, and thanks everybody. I'll be really quick because it sounds like you've got a cool lecture coming up today. So yeah, I'm coordinating the internships for our department now, and I just want to mention two really quick. The first is our Cheyenne Legislative Internship. So our legislature is having their general sessions start in January, and we have a legislative internship program that we do with them, where you go and you can work anywhere from 10 to up to 40 hours a week, and you get more or less credit depending on how many hours a week you work there. And you get to help them out with whatever they need through the course of the legislators working in their session. There's also educational experiences as part of this. So they have meetings with the interns, just meeting with the governor, with other state leaders. So it's an educational experience as well. Those applications are due on November 25th, which is the day after Thanksgiving, but you also have to do sort of an internal application with the department in SPICE. So if any of you are interested, please email me and I can send you those. I also sent out a big blast email a couple weeks ago, you may have noticed, with a bunch of that information there. So that's a cool opportunity. Another one I'll mention is our federal legislators. So the senators, we have Senator Barrasso, Senator Loomis, our Congress people, we can do internships with them. And I'll just mention Senator Barrasso is still looking for interns for his spring internships. You can go to DC and intern in his office there, but he also has offices all across Wyoming. So let me just look here real quick. You can work in his Cheyenne office, Casper, Sheridan, Rock Springs. So if you're in one of those places and you want to work in one of those offices, that's a possibility. I will mention that you have to be 21 or older and from Wyoming to do that. So I sent out a blast email on Saturday morning, you may or may not have noticed about that. And I'll just mention finally, we can give credit for a variety of types of internships. So if you're wanting to intern at a nonprofit organization, you can get credit there as well. And I'll just sort of dovetail that really briefly. So I teach in the MPA program as my main sort of area of focus here in our department, and I coordinate our nonprofit concentration in the MPA. So really quick, MPA is a very practical degree for people who want to go work in government and nonprofits. And so if you're still trying to figure out where you want to go or what you want to do, that could be another thing to do after you finish your undergrad. Zach did his MPA here, and so you probably ask him a lot about that and get more information from him, but I'll just quickly mention and sort of pitch the MPA as well as the nonprofit sector as a great place to do internships and work. There's awesome careers you can have in the nonprofit sector. So like I said, super brief. If you have any questions, send me an email, but I'd love to help you get an internship sorted. And any questions really quick before I go? Okay, well, thanks, Zach, for the quick pitch. You guys have a good class. Hopefully I'll see some of you around in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Gable.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.
See you guys.
All right. Um, so please, truly do follow up on that. If that is something that sounds interesting to you. I went ahead and dropped Dr. Taggart's email in the chat for you, if any of you want to follow up. And as he mentioned, I did my master's at the University of Wyoming through the MPA program. So that I can attest is a really fantastic program, especially if you're not entirely sure what you want to do. I know that that's not always, that's not always necessarily sounds like a ringing endorsement for a master's program, but there are, some very specified master's programs that are keyed towards a very specific line of work. And then there are some programs like the MPA that are broader and open up just a wider variety of different options to do, whether that's working in government, working for nonprofits, working for universities. All of those can be well served by something like an MPA program. So if you have more questions on that as well, feel free to email me, set up a Zoom, we can chat anytime. I'm always happy to talk about my experience in higher ed, which, I took a couple of unusual paths and a couple of usual paths. So I feel like I have a pretty wide variety of things to help with if there's anything in that area that I can help with. Other thing I saw Odin mentioned in the chat, Model Arab League. If anyone else is interested in going, the email was sent out today. I think I have that sitting right here. Maybe. But if you are, there we go. Yep. Tonight, 6:30 p.m. in the Simpson Lounge on campus, which is ANS room 139. So if you are interested in joining the Model Arab League, that is just a fantastic program as well. So it's a great way to get a lot more knowledge about Middle Eastern countries, specifically that we don't always get to cover in classes like this, or even in some of the other international studies courses that you may take. So by all means, join Odin there. I'm guessing that Odin might be going. And so, yeah, that's a great program as well. Anything else before we jump in to developing nations? Did everyone have a good weekend? I hope. Hopefully so. Okay. Well, today I do want to talk a bit about the rest, and we'll talk about why the book kind of divides into these groupings of countries. We briefly mentioned earlier some of the issues with those wide sweeping generalizations of the way that we group countries when we're talking about them in these contexts, and some of the issues that come along with that. Hopefully today we'll be able to delve a little bit further into some of those. But to get us back in the mindset, I'd like to start off today with a poll everywhere here. This will create a word cloud of responses, but I'll give you a minute. The question that I've posed here is just what comes to mind when you hear the term third world. You can respond online at polev.com/ZacharyTayloe500. Hopefully that's showing up at the top of the screen for you, that is visible. I'll drop it in the chat as well, just so you have that, because I think sometimes the Zoom kind of changes on here. Okay, so you can do that. Drop some responses on the web there, or you can text. There's a text option for Zachary Taylor 500 to 37607 to respond. And good, looks like some people here are getting the chance to start responding. All right. I'm starting to see kind of what I would expect, what I think is pretty normal in some of the associations that we have with this term third world. A couple of the big ones that are starting to poke out there: poor and poverty, underdeveloped, as is the title of our discussion today in the section of the book. I think that global went with global south. The way they do the word cloud, sometimes it starts separating words out, but yeah, the global south is a term that we will talk about today as well. Colonies, Ethiopia, so a specific country that someone might associate with this term third world. Non-democratic, war, overpopulated, corrupt, extreme. Let's see, and again, there are some words I'm trying to pair up to maybe former democracy, maybe former colonies. All right. So I don't think there's anything on here that would be too terribly surprising. We have a pretty strong embedded understanding of what third world means, or at least meant. This is, a way of referring to the countries of the world that are impoverished, countries that experience overpopulation, countries that are, at a technological deficit to the rest of the world, maybe countries who have struggled with industrialization, or who have not gone through a period of full industrialization. The countries that the global north, as opposed to the global south, and like I said, we'll talk about those terms today, but the countries that are sort of need to catch up, right? This very westernized way of thinking of there are countries who have developed, that have come into some kind of advancement as a country, that other countries have not experienced. Obviously, this is a term that is very embedded in our Cold War mentality. And I know when we talked about this before, that was the direction that I mentioned, was that we have this now outdated way of viewing the world, but there's something very, I think, very lasting about this separation of how we look at different countries around the world. Now, we've talked thus far mostly about democracies, and a fair number of democracies, as well as the communist and post-communistic states of Russia and China. That's serving as really our basis for this comparison, this first, second, and third world understanding. As this arose out of the Cold War, we have the first world, which are, the major democracies of the world after World War II. The primary candidates, you might imagine, to join the League of Nations, which would eventually evolve into the United Nations. But we also had the second world, which was, the other side of things, not just the other side of the earth when we're looking at this, from a global perspective, but the other side of that, liberal to communistic that line. So we have the major communistic countries who gained prominence. Russia obviously becoming a global competitor to the United States, insofar as those were the two superpowers during the Cold War. So we have democracy on one side being the first world. Obviously, if you can't figure that out already, obviously this theory was written by democratic people from democratic countries, so they put themselves in the first world. Then you have the second world, which are these communistic countries, and then you basically have everyone else who has not arrived yet at that point. And all of the countries that these democracies and communistic states wanted to bring into either the first or second world. Now, yes, there is an implication here that, the second world may, just be waiting to evolve into the first world. But really, the first and the second world in this understanding are competing with one another to get more countries on their side. Whoever can get the most countries to become democracies, or whoever can get the most countries to become communistic, will somehow win this Cold War. Now, we know from our history already that we've talked about in this class, that's not how the Cold War actually ended. We didn't have the ultimate victory of one or the other. Instead, we now have, countries that continue to have communistic aspects, though those, significant powers have either faltered in the case of the USSR, or changed their methodology so significantly, as China has, that we can't really recognize them as the same kind of communistic countries that they once were. But we still have this kind of deep-rooted clash between different ideologies and different ways that the world should exist. So, is this still a fitting way of looking at the world? I mentioned that, the first, second, third world designations are kind of outmoded at this point. Academically, we don't really use this terminology anymore, but we still struggle to find ways to group countries together in ways that will make sense. We have had a rise in this other terminology that came up in our poll everywhere, that being the Global South. As you can tell, there's a fair bit of similarity here when we're looking at these two maps next to one another. The Global North and Global South concepts take on more of a viewpoint of the countries that are privileged, and the countries that are economically developed and supported, as opposed to the countries that are receiving economic support in this kind of globalized economy that we have since developed. So, you may look at this and you may wonder why, China would be considered part of the Global South, why India perhaps would be considered part of the Global South. We will be talking about India coming up here soon. So, those kinds of questions make a lot of sense. We can pick and nitpick at each of these countries that we see included in the Global South and wonder why exactly they may be there. Why, China, for instance, is in this kind of, ranking of countries, is still considered to be a developing nation, even though it's one of the strongest economies on the planet. And the control that the Chinese government has over its currency helps to reinforce that. There are certain benefits that being a member of the Global South confers on a country, as far as the trade the participation in trade, the amount of control that a country has over trade within its own boundaries, as well as its participation in this global economy, is affected by their ranking in this kind of global north and global south understanding of the world. So all of these are going to be imperfect. And part of that is just that there is no right perfect way of making some kind of map where we group countries into different things. If you're, thinking through the different ways that we could do this, you might think with the amount of, economic power that goes into this creation of the global north and global south, that maybe, using a purely economic model would make more sense. Well, we have the World Bank economies grouping of countries. And you can see that this, again, shifts a couple of countries in and out of this very similar looking map that doesn't just designate the global north and the global south. We see different level of income based on a country's overall GDP. So this moves a couple of South American countries into, what we would consider under this other system, what we'd consider the global north, because they do have that higher level of average income, but it's still painting the world with this very broad brush. So what about the opposite end of things? What if we took instead a measurement that doesn't just look at country income, but instead wanted to consider a more human capital kind of way of drawing these lines? Well, we do have what's called the Human Development Index, a measurement that takes into account things like life expectancy, overall attained education, the literacy of a people, and that gives us just another different map, a different way of looking at the world. You'll see in this map, we shift much more towards most of South America falling into this kind of higher end of development. And we see, a little bit greater swath of the Middle East. Most of the countries in the Asian subcontinent have now shifted over into, kind of those bluer and greener designations. But the point is that all of these different ways of looking at the countries of the world and trying to paint the countries of the world with this broad paintbrush approach give us some kind of benefit, some kind of ability to compare countries to one another. And that's nice because I don't have to remind you that the class is called comparative government. Like, it gives us a good point of comparison where we can start lining countries up next to one another. But it's also always important to remember that these things do not come with hard, fast, unchangeable designations. And I think that was where we started to get to with the Cold War mentality, the first, second, and the third world. It sounded like it was based on, the third world being brought into the first or the second world, depending on, who won out of that kind of mentality. But that wasn't the actual outcome. We didn't see countries move during that time, truly move from the third world to the first or the second world. We haven't seen that change much for most of these countries. And as you can see, these alignments between things like the Human Development Index, the World Economies Model, the Global North and the Global South, I think that's where the global north, global south divide falls the most, because it doesn't give any kind of hope for improvement for a country, right? It places the global north as the global north. It's not like, the countries are going to move, aside from plate tectonics, it's not like the countries are going to shift from the global south to the global north with any kind of ease. And that kind of designation, that kind of understanding is makes it sound like these things are very set in stone. And that is not, I think, a positive way to view it. You might think of it as a very cynical way of viewing these designations. I remember Ethiopia being mentioned specifically in our poll everywhere. You have to think about where is the drive, where is the benefit for one of these systems for a country like Ethiopia? Does it have hope? Is there any reason to hope that living conditions under the Human Development Index can be improved in Ethiopia? Or do we just very cynically write it off as a country that will never be able to join the global north? I think that kind of hope and that kind of desire that ends up causing or creating actual real world policy is where we see the biggest deficit with these kinds of systems. Because, even for all of its problems in the first, second, and third world model, we still had some kind of ideology that there was the potential for movement, that there was the potential for countries to, under the guise, and I think that's where I'm going here, yeah, under the guise of being brought into these systems, for countries to become more like the first and the second world. Now, the three main ways that countries then could develop, and I've kind of talked around it a bit. Obviously, I'm leaning towards what we have now is kind of a replacement for the first, second, and third world model, which is the developed, developing, and underdeveloped countries. I think of all of them, that kind of language leaves the most room for actual change. Now, the problem is that the three major ways for countries to move between groups, as you can see here, are extremely Western centric, right? They and not just as in the Western countries of the world, but the ideology of there is a point to reach, and that point is a developed democracy. That feels problematic to me. I don't know if that hits all of you in the same way. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you have done these readings and truly sit there and continue to feel that a developed democracy is what every country in the world should strive to be. That is a legitimate position that most of the developed democracies of the world certainly hold, is that this end goal for countries right now is to become a developed democracy. But the struggle is that is often done on the terms of the pre-existing developed democracies. Be that the United Kingdom, the United States, France, the Netherlands, these countries that have at various points engaged in colonialism and imperialism, and not just in a historical sense either. The United States waging war in Afghanistan and implementing a government in Afghanistan that was, very democratic in its initial appearance, but has since failed to maintain that level of democracy. It's easy to talk about these things in terms of Germany and Japan, as we did last week, because Germany and Japan are countries that have maintained this developed democracy kind of mindset. But I very much so wanted to point out why Germany and Japan do that in a different way from each other, and also then from this idealized form that we see in the rest of the world. Germany being a country that was able to really craft its own constitution with influence from the UK and the US, certainly, but it became a very German constitution and thus has held stability in Germany because it was something that was not forced upon Germany by other countries. And I think that that's when we see the most tenuous grasp of this, moving into the developed world kind of approach, is when we're forcing countries to do this. Japan, on the other hand, did not experience that. Japan is one of those quote unquote success stories of being forced to adopt a constitution that may not have been entirely indigenous to Japan, and yet they have found ways based in Japanese history to embrace that constitution and to make it their own. That is a struggle that we come to anytime one country is forcing a type of government on another. Because the simple answer, I think, at the end of all of this is that there isn't a certain correct answer. Democracy in and of itself, this sort of advanced democracy idea is not necessarily the right form of government for every country all the time. It is a movement along a spectrum that may fit different countries at different times, but usually not when America tries to force it on other countries. That kind of modern imperialism is something that we are still struggling with and will continue to struggle with, because we have, quote unquote, moved out of this period of colonialism and imperialism. And yet we still hold on to this idea that, we can improve other countries by forcing certain types of government on them. So let me roll back just real quick on this slide. Obviously, one of the first ways that we see moving a country from, the developed to developing to fully developed kind of positioning in the world is the process of industrialization. And this is something that, again, the developing or underdeveloped countries of the world are at a disadvantage for, because they didn't get there first. The United States, the United Kingdom, for actually all of the countries that we have discussed so far, maybe slight exception for Japan, because as we talked about during the Meiji Restoration, Japan was somewhat reluctantly brought into the modern age, but Japan was still the one that chose for themselves to embrace that modernization and industrialization and adapt it, especially in their military. When industrialization happens for a country on its own terms, then that industrialization tends to be effective and tends to stick. But there's a very strong argument that industrialization has to function under that model. That industrialization has to be adopted by a country that will struggle through it, not being forced upon it by a country that has already gone through industrialization. This is the help / how much are we hurting kind of concept of development, because it may make sense for, put this in terms of a small project that we see very frequently in, our development work around the world. Engineers Without Borders. If any of you happen to be an engineer, Engineers Without Borders is a fantastic program, very similar to Doctors Without Borders. It attempts to connect areas where there's low educational development, not a lot of engineers, with places that there are a lot of engineers. We have an Engineers Without Border program that goes out of the University of Wyoming. A few years back, there was an Engineering Without Borders program that wanted to build a well outside of Stone Town in Tanzania. So they put together the trip, go over to Tanzania. They are able to build the well for a small rural village. And it's wonderful. It brings, fresh water to this rural village that had previously had to trek. I want to say it was like 15 miles to a clean, fresh source of water. So Engineers Without Borders goes over, does that, does education programs, helps to teach, local men and women how to get water from the well, builds this well and implements it in the society. Engineers Without Borders comes back because funding isn't unlimited, and sets a plan to go and periodically visit this well. So after the first visit, like a year later, things are going well. The well, sorry, it gets mixed up. Things are going really well because the well has helped to provide clean water to this small village, which, clean water is one of those essential provisions that people need to be able to prosper. So it is going very well after 1 year. The second time that Engineers Without Borders goes back, they find that the well has been fenced off and the people are now being charged to gain access to that clean water. And obviously the engineers ask why this is the case. And it turns out that a local warlord from the neighboring town where people had previously been going to get water was no longer seeing the revenue that was coming from that travel, and so decided to capitalize on this well being placed near the smaller village, and took it over and was now charging people for access to the well. So first of all, good, bad, as far as, first world nation, the United States, this program Engineers Without Borders going over and working to help build a well that was necessary for people in Tanzania. Obviously, very altruistic intentions, the good side of development, in that kind of capacity that we were not colonizing, and it sounds funny to say that in this example, but we were not, trying to imperialize in Tanzania. We were trying to just enable them to have a better quality of life. So is that a bad thing? Is that a bad example of this kind of, idea of developing an underdeveloped country? Well, certainly not. But it is such a complex system, and there are so many aspects that we cannot account for in this kind of global development idea, that it becomes very difficult to see any kind of development as truly successful. Because if we had known that that was going to happen, should that well have been built in the first place, I mean, there's no possible way to know. It was still an attempt, in the best of intentions and the best of ways, to assist with a small development project. And yet we couldn't account for all of those other factors that may or may not have come into play if that had been a locally devised and created, no outside intervention, a locally devised well that had been built. It's that these systems are so complex and are so involved that it becomes very difficult for effective forms of industrialization to be implemented in countries if it's another country doing it. And that's not just other countries writ large. That can be organizations in other countries, or even international, non-governmental organizations that may have the best interest in mind. Now, these examples here, just to refresh your memory on the difference between colonialism and imperialism, the primary difference between these two is the intent to occupy. So if you are creating a colony, you are invading somewhere to have your people live there. So if, the Dutch are trying to colonize South Africa, they are sending people there to live there permanently. Imperialism can be more ideologically based. It can be financially based. It can be, the territory, the tributary kind of model. Any of those fall more into this class of imperialism. But these are the three main ways that we engage with trying to help countries develop. And so, I guess the question that comes out of all of this is, how do we actually do this? How do we actually benefit countries that may not be seeking themselves to develop? And there's really no right answer to that question. We end up with just this massive swath of problems, where we can sometimes find small degrees of success, but it's very rare to see, a full-blown quote unquote successful model of implementation here, as has led to the issues that are ongoing in Afghanistan, the issues that are ongoing in Iraq, that have, I think, become very good examples of why this kind of modern day imperialism is not all that better at creating developed democracies than any of the previous forms of imperialism or colonialism that the United States has engaged in. I want to pause real quick before I go to the next one, because that was a lot. Are there questions on that sort of interactive portion? Like I said, I feel like I just said a whole lot of words. I hope they made sense. Okay, I'm at least getting a nod from Jean-Luc, so that's very reassuring. But any questions on sort of the positives and negatives of these interactions between countries when it comes to what results from this first, second, third world, nowadays global north, global south, developed, underdeveloped, developing, those kinds of designations that we like to use for countries? Cool. I think I'm feeling very mindful right now of the whole colonial problem, because over the weekend I went to the Bridgerton experience with my wife down in Denver. It was a really fun ball, but like definitely makes you take a step back and think about, how guilty all of these Western countries are of just ruining third world countries. To lighten that a little bit, I wanted to throw a couple of political cartoons up here for you, that I think just help us get some context for how these things function in real life, and also the fact that it doesn't just have to be countries that we see creating this kind of colonial or imperial type of experience. So just a couple things here to laugh at if you want, but the imperialism of the NFL, I think that's something that we experience very strongly in Wyoming, since we don't have an NFL team of our own. However, go Pokes, because we have a very good football team. I'll be an honorary coach, I think, on the 18th or 19th. So certainly there's college support here, but you may be feeling that if you're a big fan of the NFL, and settling into UW, there's not a lot here. You're pretty much forced to like the Broncos, and that's just by geographic relevance, or whatever team you might like from where you are originally from. I was born in Philly, so I will always have some adherence to the Eagles, but yeah, you're kind of stuck in a place like Wyoming, picking a team from somewhere else to follow. So to wrap this up, the last idea that I want to put out there is that we have to live in one of these systems, right? If we accept the global north and the global south, if we accept first, second, and third world, if we accept developed, developing, and underdeveloped, whatever system it is that we choose to accept, and however we choose to group countries, we're not doing it from outside of that system. We are not able to take an edict perspective on how we organize countries in the world. So we will always in these be creating groups in which we are in one of the groups. The danger that we have with this, and something that we see both now in a very, politically tribalized system, which I mentioned because tomorrow is election day, and I hope you are all going to vote. Please vote. That's the kind of the best way we're stuck with trying to express political opinions in this country. So I really hope you're all planning on voting tomorrow. But we end up getting stuck with this us versus them mentality. In its extreme form here in this meme, the our blessed homeland, their barbarous wastes, even though we're all just people kind of idea, we end up separating ourselves from others. And let's see, I just forgot the philosopher. I wonder if I've written down. Chantal, if you want a philosopher who writes on the dangers of this us versus them mentality, Chantal Mouffe has written pretty extensively on us versus them, and the illusion that this creates and all of the problems that brings with it. Now, when we do this between countries, obviously that creates conflict. And that creates either a necessity to bring another country more to our perspective, or to view that country as an enemy that threatens the existence of our perspective. And you can see how that brings issue to our global interactions. When we see this within our own country, which I think we see more and more of nowadays, this has that same effect. We run into this problem of creating too much of a differentiation between us and them, that the deeper that line and that separation goes, the harder it is to recover from it, and to reunite as a single understanding of a population. This, I think, is the worst aspect to come out of the Cold War, is this deeply rooted belief that there is no ability for democracies and communistic countries, or really democracies and the rest of the world, kind of as your book posits it, that there's no ability for those to be to find compromise. There's no reconciliation for these countries existing. It is that one must change to suit the other, as opposed to encouraging countries to develop their own forms of governance. So we will continue on Wednesday. We'll talk a bit more about why there are some countries that have, hit these milestones or not, countries that have failed to advance in the way that the rest of the world may suggest, as well as discussing some of these forms of government we see that fall outside of these kind of normative beliefs that democracy or communism are the primary forms of government that exist around the world. So, any final questions before we wrap up? All right, excellent. Well, thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you on Wednesday.
Thank you. See you Wednesday.
Thanks.